Yeah, just at the outset, I want to say what's desirable for any adequate solution to the mind-body problem. And the conditions I require are a clear ontology to saying what sort of things exist, realism about both the mental and the physical, consistency and engagement with contemporary physics. So I take the physical world to be very important, but also consistency with our self-understanding as minds and agents, and also a lucid explanation of the mind-physics relationship. Very often you get theories which kind of fudge things a bit, and I want to avoid that. I want to have things very clear. And the first metaphor I'm going to consider is inside versus outside. This is the logo of the 2008 Tucson conference, which I attended. And the idea is that the inside world is the familiar world of our experience. It's kind of familiar. The outside world is the world of physics, but that might be stranger than we first thought, especially with the advent of quantum mechanics. So this is it. From the outside, the brain is a physical object, obeying exactly the same rules as any other physical system. And when you dissect it, or do an X-ray, or, any scan you like, it remains a physical system doing it behaving according to exactly the same laws as anything else in the universe. And the inside view is the world of our experience. Here, I'm imagining myself watching a punting scene. Now, there are difficulties with this view, this metaphor, for physicalists. Physicalism, by definition, is that the metaphysical system where physics is primary and mind must be explained in terms of physics. But this implies that the physical does all the causal work, physical laws do all the causal work, and mind is irrelevant to behavior. And non-zombies are inexplicable. Because of that leads many people towards panpsychism, which is physicalism, but where you say that mind exists everywhere in the universe as a brute fact. But then how can these fundamental mental properties do any causal work when the physical properties seem to do this already? So we go a step beyond panpsychism, and we arrive at my own position, which is pan-idealism. So I have to explain what that is. And probably most people know that panpsychism is that everything that exists has mental properties in addition to the physical properties. Panpsychism is a variety of physicalism, and it inherits all the problems at the microscopic level. What's the relationship between mind and physics? Pan-idealism is more radical. It says that everything that exists is a mind. pan-idealism is therefore a variety of idealism, and this change is a very important metaphysical step. The catalogue of things that exist are the same in all cases. So in standard physicalism, you have atoms and trees and electrons and animals and galaxies. The same in pan-idealism, except that everything has mental properties as well. But in pan-idealism, the catalogue of things is the same, but these things that exist are all minds. So, pan-idealism, everything that exists is a mind. Physics must be explained entirely in mentalistic terms, in terms of minds and their properties. And about these minds, there are a multitude of minds which are omnipresent, and of course, omnipresent through space and time. I've sneaked in some physical ideas there, but we have to say what omnipresent is in terms of the minds. Each mind has a qualitative percept of other minds, and each mind possesses agency, so that most minds are extremely simple. They cannot think, but also because of this, they cannot misperceive their surroundings. You know, human beings are likely to be misperceived, misled in their percepts, but that's impossible for very simple things. And here's an example. You've got the young slits experiment, usually done with photons, but it can be done also with large molecules. And depending on the number of slits that are open, you get a different pattern of places where these molecules or atoms or particles land. And the explanation in pan-idealism, according to pan-idealism, would be that the entity in question, the mind, the relevant mind, can perceive the totality of its surroundings, and its propensities to act depend upon the entirety of the experimental setup. And this is even more extreme, where we have an interferometer experiment where particles are going in totally different directions. So, how are we to explain physics in terms of these very simple minds? How is it possible in principle? Well, the reason it becomes possible in principle is that our sole access to the world is through our percepts. Every human being throughout the entirety of history, both lay people and scientists, only have access to the world through their percepts and their agency. This means we can define physics in terms of mind, at least in principle, and the panpsychism part assures that this physics will not be gappy, unlike most forms of idealism restrict themselves to just humans. But here we're saying everything is a mind. The sole form of causation in pan-idealism is agency. physical laws are merely mathematical descriptions, not causes. And this means that libertarian free will is possible in pan-idealism. And that fits with our normal intuitions before we do any philosophy, that we are free and we are agents. And I have to go into a bit more detail about how physical entities are, physical objects are defined in terms of minds. So each physical property is identical to a specific optimal synthesis of the mathematical structures within the percepts of all minds. We assume that this synthesis as a mathematical fact, even though we don't ourselves have access to all percepts. So it's very easy to assume that you have minds, but we can't have access to the percept of a photon. But we assume that these, if you look at the structure of the desk, it's kind of rectangular in shape. And so that's a mathematical structure within your percept. And by combining these, we arrive at the physical structure of the desk. Okay. I'm going backwards. Sorry about that. So we're considering an example: intersubjective consilience length. Here we have a bone and a ruler next to it. A scientist is looking at the bone and ruler, and they take up equal portions of her visual field. And so she concludes that this bone is 5 centimeters long. And let's go back a bit. That scientific results aren't accepted until they're verified. And so another scientist comes along and says he agrees, and they decide to republish the result in Nature. Now, this would be kind of too anthropocentric if we defined length just in terms of human percepts, but we can extend this. So dogs are sufficiently similar to us that they have similar visual percepts, and even though they don't have much cognitive power, we can assume that their percept of the bone and ruler are somewhat similar to our own. And even in the absence of any human observers, the percepts of the dog as it wanders round the room provides some evidence for the length of the bone. So our definition is that physical length is identically the maximal intersubjective consilience of perceived length derived by combining the percepts of all minds. And this, you can even use general relativity. This is even compatible with length as understood in general relativity. So you can go on to kind of complete physics in pan-idealism. So we use intersubjective consilience to define length or distance, as we've just shown. We use the same principle to define time. Somewhat similarly, we've essentially defined space-time, and these ideas can be fleshed out consistent with contemporary physics. And I do this in much greater detail in my book. Physics is fully explained in mentalistic terms alone. Any attempt at further explanation reintroduces paradoxes. So if you think that there is some real physical length between two entities, say an atom at either end of the bone, that's over and above the percepts of the entities themselves as defined, then you run into paradoxes. The second one is grammatical viewpoints. In fact, this is, which I'm only going to take a look at very briefly. And although I'm not interested in philosophy of language, because pan-idealism deals with these very simple minds, you can be rather generous and describe them as percepts, as persons. And from the first person viewpoint is how I perceive myself and the world. From the third person viewpoint, I'm a physical system, so looking at my brain from the outside. But this is the viewpoint of a mythical, omniscient, objective observer. And this is the viewpoint of physicalism, which is bad metaphysics. And instead, we replace the third-person viewpoint, which is the second-person viewpoint. And from the second-person viewpoint, I'm also a physical system where, by a fairly standard definition, the second-person viewpoint is the intersubjective viewpoint. And in fact, this is what scientists really do. This is how science really works. And it's perfectly adequate to define science in these terms. And the mind-body problem ceases to be a hard problem in Chalmers terms, i.e. impossible, where we don't have any way to get a grip with it. But with pan-idealism, you at least have a principled way to get to grips with the mind-body problem. That's it. There are references to a couple of books and self-advertising there, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you.
All right. Sure.
Thank you. I have two questions.
Yeah, sure.
One is, how does by the way, I'm not a physicalist or a panpsychist or idealist, but
Yeah.
I'm just curious, how do you guys explain the fact that if you stimulate the brain, you get sometimes this percept in a predictable manner? Let's say if it's a visual cortex and visual percept, auditory cortex, auditory percept, and things like that. Can we explain this from the idealistic framework?
Yes, I was going to say the pan-idealism is perfectly realistic. It's a perfectly realistic theory about sort of neurons and molecules and atoms and everything that's going on within the brain. And in fact, it's even more realistic than physicalism. If you look at it, science from a strictly physicalist point of view, you find that the real world kind of dissolves into mathematics, and so you don't know whether something is instantiated or not. And yeah, I've lost my thread, but that's...
I guess what you're probably saying is that even though you cannot imagine, but this stimulation is basically acting within the framework of mathematical kind of laws or some kind of...
It's... You don't have to imagine laws. Laws are just facts that meet our description of what they accurately describe what we experience.
So, how would you describe someone under like psychosis or detachment from reality?
Okay. Well, human beings can be have incorrect perceptions if they're mentally ill or taking some drug, or they're more commonplace things. If you're walking along a road, you might see a bin liner rolling along the road, blowing in the wind, but then you realize it's a cat. The difference there is that an individual who's hallucinating or experiences a mental illness, their percept won't agree with anyone else's percept. And it's swamped, it's anomalous. And when you do the intersubjective consilience, that they will be an outlier. Okay.
Would you define memory in this context as mind? Would you define mind as memory and associative decision making? And if so, how is that? How's defining idealism different from morphic resonance?
How is idealism different from?
Morphic resonance. Morphic resonance.
I don't know anything about morphic resonance, but things exist in the world just as they exist for standard physicalism, but they are, in fact, what they are in fact is minds. So your theory of memory and perception would go more or less the same as in standard physicalism, that memories will be stored in some standard pattern of molecules within the brain, and perception would be in terms of information flow. So that bit wouldn't be any different.
How would you define mind exactly in this context?
I just do it in who is it? Not is it Nagel? Is what it's like to be. So I'm just fairly naive in that I have qualitative perceptual experiences, and I am an agent. I can make a difference of a world in the world. Yeah.
What exists, and nobody knows the answer to that.
Yeah.
I think it's 25 minutes, so thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker is going to be Harald Walach from Kazimieras University in Vilnius, in Lithuania, and he's going to talk about souls create their bodies, why consciousness is primary, and Leibnizian reminder.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. That was actually a very good talk for what I'm going to say, because this is more or less something very similar. I'm going to go back to Leibniz, who is one of the very interesting philosophers of German tongue. Normally we see mind as something emerging, coming up from bottom, and somehow it arises. The question is where? Where does it arise? Oops, why is it not working? Okay. Yeah. Where along this trajectory does it arise? Or does it arise? Or is it there right from the beginning? And that is what we've just heard. Panpsychism or pan-idealism or pan-en-psychism, however you want to call it. And this is something that Leibniz has actually introduced, to my knowledge, for the first time, because he said consciousness does not arise. It does never arise because it's always there. It's primary. Or co-primary to matter. It depends on how you read Leibniz. He's a bit difficult to read, and there is no real agreement, I think, but I would read it as being co-primary. The basic insight is what is foundational for something what is foundational for X cannot be explained by X, or the other way around, what is foundational by something cannot be explained by that something, right? So a plan can explain a house, but the house cannot explain the plan. And in the same sense, mathematics is useful and necessary for physics, but you cannot use physics to construct mathematics. Like axiomatics is necessary for mathematics, but you cannot use mathematics to explain axiomatics. And in the same sense, whatever is foundational for X, that's a generic formulation, or is a precondition, or is necessary for X, cannot be explained by X. That's a very simple argument, which we can use to say consciousness is foundational for science, hence science cannot explain consciousness. Whatever we do as scientists, we presuppose consciousness. Whether we measure, whether we theorize, whether we model, whether we do anything in science, we always presuppose consciousness. That's the basic idealistic argument, right? And it's even true for quantum physics, because it presupposes a measurement process, however you want to define it. That means science always presupposes consciousness. Now here comes Leibniz saying, well, the monads, the basic constituents of the world, are conscious entities. They are the basic entities of the universe. Whitehead went as far as saying all actual entities have a mental and a physical pole, and this is actually derived from Leibniz's idea. So Leibniz was the first saying, these are the actual entities that are imbued with basic conscious activity, he called it perception, and striving. They cannot perish, nor do they arise. They exist, in Leibniz's view, by divine creation, and they can only be going away by divine destruction. And from an individual perspective, they represent the all, everything. Every individual monad has a perspective on the whole universe at all times and expresses it from its individual perspective. So what a monad does is unfolding this individual perspective during their lives, as it were. They don't die, they wake up and they go to sleep. So conscious activity cannot be produced by mechanical or mental, or physiological activities. And this Leibniz produces in his famous mill example, I think it's paragraph 18 of his monadology, saying, if there were a machine that were to produce conscious activity, and we were able to blow it up so that we can walk into it, like into a mill, we would only see millstones and mechanic activity, but never perception or emotion. Hence, consciousness must be different. That's his argument. He says everything is full of monads, and we, human beings, are one central monad representing all aspects of our physiology as it unites it. And then comes a very difficult word. Leibniz says monads do not have windows. Nothing comes into them. Everything that we experience comes out of ourselves. That is the Leibnizian perspective. So what we see as affecting monads, such as sense perceptions or so, is inner activity that is coordinated with whatever happens to other monads via a concept Leibniz calls pre-established harmony. And this pre-established harmony is a kind of non-local coordination principle. It coordinates all physical events in the world and the perception and apperception, so what we perceive of the world from within. And that guarantees that whatever happens in the world or in our minds is represented faithfully by the activity of the monads. Here is a quote from Leibniz. He says, souls follow their own laws, while bodies follow theirs, namely the rules of motion. Nevertheless, these two entities of completely different kind meet and are coordinated like two clocks, which have been perfectly set in the same way, although they may be of totally different making. It is exactly this which I call pre-established harmony. In order to understand that, because it sounds a little bit like an out-of-date, old-fashioned concept, but if we want to understand it, what we need is a principle of non-local coordination that is lawful, but not mediated by local forces or causes. We normally only think in local frameworks. I press the button, something happens, it goes back. I press the button, it goes forward. And we have signals mediating that. Now, Leibniz universe is a non-local universe. And what we need to do that, we need a non-local principle, and here is one. We published a couple of years ago that paper generalized quantum theory in Foundation of Physics, and this is a very simple argument, actually. We dropped everything from quantum theory that is normally used for making quantum theory applicable to physical systems. And we leave the only defining concept of a quantum theory, and this is the ability to deal with incompatible or non-commuting operations. Normally we have a commuting or compatible algebra like this, right? A times B is the same as B times A, or A times B minus B times A is 0. That is what we are used to. Now, if you want to define an algebra for quantum mechanics, you need a C-star algebra that is like this. A times B is not equal to B times A. They do not commute. Or if you do this, A times B minus B times A, you get something that is different from 0. And this is exactly the Heisenberg uncertainty relationship. And this you always need when you have a system that is dealing with incompatible operations. Actually, there is one system you all know that is always using incompatible operations, namely our consciousness. Because if you measure something using our consciousness, for instance, our state of mind, then it changes. And this is exactly the definition of an incompatible system. I brought you a little picture to illustrate that. If you look at it, people normally see a parrot, right? But it's not only a parrot, it's actually a woman dressed up like a parrot. And this is just a fun picture to remind you there are things which you have to use two perspectives at the same time to understand it. And this is what incompatibility means. Here are examples of incompatible variables. In physics, this is pretty clear. For instance, location and momentum, or time and energy, was what Robert Penrose used in his formalism. In the generalized context, we don't really know what it is because it hasn't been researched very well. But here are a couple of examples. For instance, individuality and community, or separateness and connectedness, or structure and function, novelty and confirmation, and so forth. Now, the point is, the generalized entanglement system or proposal is that whenever you have complementary complementarity within a system, complementarity between global and local observables. Then you get entanglement. Now here you have, for instance, community or connection and individuality and separateness. And I would stipulate these are incompatible variables, and by virtue of this, these are entangled, no matter what size or makeup the system is. So this is a kind of expanding entanglement from physical systems into general systems. And if you do that, you can actually derive a non-local coordination system, for instance, for physiological processes, say our immune system, our cells, our physiological bodies, and for our mental system. Whatever is in our minds can also be used like that, and you can use that to understand the non-local correlation between mental and physiological elements, and indeed the whole world. This would be a modern reinterpretation of Leibniz's pre-established harmony. We published that a couple of years ago in E-Logos, a philosophy journal coming out of Czechoslovakia, I think. So this is what I wanted to tell you. So if I'm summing up, I would say in a Leibnizian perspective, consciousness is at least co-primary, probably primary. And what we need there is a coordination between mental and physical events that is non-local. And I showed you that a generalized entanglement could foster such a non-local correlated I can't say mechanism because it's not a mechanism. I would say regularity. That means bodies do not really create consciousness. Consciousness is there, and perhaps it's the other way around, and souls create their bodies. So if you want some of these papers, send me an email. I can send them to you. If you are free next Tuesday, I present the transhumanism report which I've written, and that was the end of my talk.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll start with the first question. Or is there? Okay.
I haven't read like this, I will say, nor in German, but I'm just intrigued. What's the noun in German for consciousness? Is it Geist, like soul or spirit?
Sorry, the what?
In German,
The noun?
the word, the noun, Leibniz uses for consciousness. I'm wondering, is it Geist, spirit or soul, or is it Bewusstsein?
He uses different words. He uses Bewusstsein. He uses Geist. Geist would be the consciousness, the soul consciousness of a human being. But he uses words like percept. He also writes a lot in French. So he says perception, aperception, and esprit. He uses, as far as I know, and Geist in German. Yeah.
Thank you for the interesting lecture. I have a question. Do you elaborate something about the topic of Leibniz, which was
Can you speak up? I don't hear you well enough.
Leibniz paletted this term, is policy of destiny, but God decide all the time what the world should be, and it's like a quantum collapse. Do you use this?
No, I'm not using quantum collapse terminology because that is really typical for the physical quantum theory. What we've been using is the algebraic quantum theory and dropped elements from there, and then you have the algebra of non-commuting operations. That's actually sufficient for that model. And I don't know whether we would be able, I don't think we would be using that. I must confess, I'm a psychologist and a philosopher, so I'm not a physicist. But my physicist colleague, Hartmann Römer, was the theoretical physicist of Freiburg University, and he actually wrote the formalism. So if I think with his mind as far as I can, he would probably say, no, we don't use the Schrödinger equation formalism because that's too physicalistic. Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that we worked together, but he has been proposing this dual aspect more
Yes.
theory, right? And there he suggested that something is there first, and then that splits into sort of mental
Yes.
And that's very different from your view.
No, it's not really different. It's just another approach. Because what you have from a Leibnizian perspective, as I showed you in that quote of Leibniz, is that image of the two clocks. Leibniz had these ideas, if you put two clocks on a board, they start to synchronize. And that was a very intriguing phenomenon for him. And he used that as an image for the two realms of physical and mental phenomena, how they are coordinated. So this is actually the very same thing. Only that Leibniz does not speak about a symmetry break. That's a very modern physical concept. That is what Atmansbacher uses, right? And but otherwise it's very similar. Yes?
Because you mentioned that there's not enough
This one?
Yes, you said that there's not enough, let's say, study or research on what to use.
This one?
outside.
Yeah.
So if you look at what happens with precision and momentum and time and energy, there's something really beautiful happening there that is given by the most beautiful theorem in physics and mathematics, in my opinion, which is the Emmy theorem. So
Which theorem?
Emmy, Netter,
Emmy. Emmy Noether. Oh, you're right.
So sorry, my pronunciation is super bad. But anyway, so what she taught us is that if you have a quantity that is conserved, then you have so you have a symmetry and then a conserved quantity. So that's what you get if you have, for example, a transformation that is invariant under location, under space, then momentum is conserved. If you have a transformation that is invariant under rotation, then you have angular momentum conserved. If you have a transformation that is invariant in time, you get energy conservation. So maybe that helps as a guideline to use Noether's theorem to find what you're looking for on the other side.
That's a very good, thank you very much. So it would be the conservation of,
Look for a symmetry, and then comes the conservation. And
Thank you.
And those are your time, energy, precision, momentum, and your incompatible variables.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
This is universal. Everyone in physics happens. So you can have. The other thing I found super crazy is that Leibniz and Newton were fighting over who invented calculus.
I know.
And one is like the father of physicalism, and the other one, that's mind blowing. Anyway, just like
Last one.
I apologize for asking a stupid question, but I missed most of your talk. I was in here for the last couple of minutes. But I'm curious as to whether your model actually calculates anything, or is it just momentum type?
You're curious whether the model has been calculated, or what did you say? No, it's a phenomenological model.
Any more questions? Okay, then.
Thank you. Well,
Okay, our next speaker is John Sanfey from London, an independent scholar, and he's going to talk about the observational reference frame for invariance through time.
well, thank you, Uzi. Well, as you might have guessed, I'm suggesting that the observational frame of reference for invariance in time is consciousness, which exists in the now and exists simultaneously with our percept and with our inner reality. So what I'm going to suggest primarily is that subjectivity has a specific function, has evolved in nature for a particular reason. And the effects of its function, the effects of its action, make it appear to be a property of physical reality. And the reason that's so is because it actually operates, I'm postulating that it operates below the level of empirical reality. It creates observables, it creates regularities. It sits on top of perceptual action, most of which is unconscious, but combined, the system is to create regularities in time. and that's why it sits below empirical reality, because its necessary function is involved creating what physics describes or explains. So the lens I'll be examining this question through is, why is solipsism non-falsifiable? I mean, we've heard two talks about basically idealist. I mean, nobody disagrees that solipsism is non-falsifiable, but because it's non-falsifiable, suppose that subjectivity did have a specific action. That action would necessarily be mistaken for a fact about, or the effects of the action would necessarily be mistaken for physical facts because they would be unobservable. So to go straight into it, what is physics looking at? Physics is looking at observations, and it explains those observations as states of motion, continuous motion, that's causally ordered motion. And by causally ordered, I mean that without necessarily an arrow of time, in a time-symmetric equation describing motion, no 2 points in the motion can exist at the same time, which is a kind of a problem, because every point in physics, ontologically, is actually a tiny interval of time containing motion from A to B, and such that A and B cannot coexist. So it follows logically that what we actually experience must be some retention of A. Let's call it AR in relation to B. And there's nothing particularly new here. I think Husserl and somebody said even Aristotle and St. Augustine were all aware of this as a problem, this arising from the continuity of time. So it gets even more tricky when you realize, as Stephen Wolfram did, that if an observing system is also composed of matter in motion, it's simply impossible to know in advance which AR is going to be part of the invariance that becomes the regularities that we see as physical objects and ultimately convert into physical laws, with all of which are based on invariance in some way. It's simply not possible to know in advance. There has to be some rule or something going on. And that rule, or whatever action that is an observer action. It just follows, it can't be anything else. So this means that whether or not you're an idealist or a realist, whatever physics is describing is the result of this necessary action, or at least exists because of this necessary action. And there must be something in physics that is functionally equivalent to that action, whether or not it doesn't endorse idealism by any means. It just says that because physics describes observations and subjectivity or subjective human awareness has a necessary function in creating observables, that there must be something within physics that is equivalent. And this is the heart of the theory that builds upon this principle, really. And it's a functional identity. It's not a structural identity like in IIT, for instance. This is that perceptual action is equal to the mathematics required for empirical accuracy. And I think that's a principle, a fundamental principle. But so far we've been talking about what's largely unconscious perceptual action. We need to find something specific to subjectivity. And this is where the simultaneity comes in, because I think the simultaneity between us as observers and the redness that we are experiencing is a part of something it is like to see red. The redness is occurring at the same time that I am experiencing the redness. The two things are part of the same phenomenon. And that's all it means. It doesn't describe an apparent simultaneity between two events that we see, because special relativity tells us that those are relative to the motion of the observer. And this is why I think it's such a useful model to think of consciousness as being a simultaneous epistemic frame of reference for the things we experience. And actually, it looks both ways, because it's also the simultaneous frame of reference for the inner reality, which of course is part of the problem we're trying to explain. So if subjectivity specifically has a purpose, we need to prove that it has causal power of some sort. And by proof, to constitute proof, this argument has to be deductive, and it should be a deduction from a premise that's completely certain. So what is completely certain? I mean, that's about it. We don't know if it's physical or what, but we know there's not nothing, there's something. But there is one more thing. As a simultaneous observer, I know that I am not knowingly causing the existence of reality. I can be completely certain of that. But a non-conscious system cannot know that. It's not logically possible for it to be certain. And I think this is an objective test for conscious AI, by the way. So a non-conscious observer, one that all its perceptual information comes from temporally sequential processes of some sort. So it's observing, it knows it's observing self as physical, there's nothing else. It knows that its observing systems could be giving false information, perhaps completely false information. And there's nothing it can learn that would make it certain that it, as a system, is not causing what it perceives to be real. It's just not logically possible. But a conscious observer, well, we have evidence that something non-observable exists. We understand the hard problem. We have direct evidence that something unobservable and inexplicable, or apparently inexplicable, exists. And we exist simultaneously with our observations, so we know what we're doing. Sorry, I thought I must have deleted a line there. So this suggests a purpose for consciousness, why subjectivity has evolved. And it's really about uncertainty. You know, subjectivity creates inexplicable, it makes the inexplicable phenomena real and factual because we experience it. So it enables us to create options that cannot be produced by known rules. We can create options out of nothing. We can create counterfactuals, and we're unbound by certainty. In fact, it makes us skeptical and stubborn, but it allows imagination. It allows us to conceptualize the unknown, to generate options that there's no counterfactuals, and to be imaginative. So the next question then is, how do you formulate, if this is a bridge between subjectivity and physical the world described by physics, how can it be formulated physically? And actually there's an interesting way of doing this. So suppose that nothing existed, but somehow there was awareness. Now, I can't imagine that without imagining some sort of space, but it's a logical argument. You don't need to imagine it. It's just suppose it's possible that there's nothing, no space, nothing, but somehow there is awareness. So is there something? I mean, people like Sartre would have said yes, this is pre-reflective awareness. I think Descartes would say the same, that there's a bruteness about knowing that we're conscious. But if it wasn't true, if nothing existed but awareness, and we didn't know that this was something, that state is identical to not being aware. So why is that important? It means that it's not logically possible, I think, to be aware without knowing that we're aware. And why is that important? Well, that's an interesting thing, because once we know we're aware, there are two explanatory paradigms, just as there are for physical reality. Even if nothing exists except awareness, there are two explanatory paradigms. We might have created awareness in some previous time and played a trick on ourselves and forgot about it, or just forgot for some other reason. In this situation, time and causal dynamics are internal to the experience of subjectivity, to the observer. And the observed is just the concept of that awareness exists. In an objective perspective. It's the opposite. Here we imagine it's more logical that something unrelated to the mind created existence, in this case, created awareness. And then you begin to doubt that we are real at all, and we have the heart problem, and the observer becomes insignificant in relation to the causal dynamics that are external to the observer. But there are two perspectives. And I think what this argument shows us is that the two perspectives constitute awareness as we experience it. They're both necessary, they're opposite, they're mutually exclusive. In that sense, it's a kind of subjective-objective complementarity of two perspectives that have the opposite time structure, the opposite dimensionality with causal dynamics and time, but they're both necessary for the existence of awareness. And this has some interesting consequences. I mean, it suggests that the operation of consciousness is by two ontologically opposite but equivalent perspectives, and both necessary perspectives. And it would also suggest that since awareness is more certain than the existence of physical reality, I mean, going back to the notion that solipsism is non-falsifiable, given that awareness is more fundamental, this suggests that it may project dualities into physics, and part of the reason why there are paradoxes in physics around locality versus non-locality, and things like that is because we are projecting the operation of the human mind when we try to conceptualize explanations for invariance in time. We're projecting how the mind operates. So I'll give you a moment to see this. I came across this a few weeks ago, a quote from Heisenberg in 1958. I mean, what I find interesting about this is that this is really the heart of quantum mechanics. And he's actually referring in this quote to something Bohr said, describing the Planck constant as a coupling constant between observer and observed, which sounds similar to what was, I think, said yesterday by Brown in his talk, but I don't think this is particularly revolutionary, but it's just a different light on the problem. And what I would suggest is that actually awareness is more certain than have I gone wrong here? Awareness is more certain than any other phenomenon. But I think what this suggests is that it's not irreducible. It can be reduced conceptually to two perspectives which are equally valid, the subjective perspective and the objective perspective, and each with their different time dimensionality, causal dimensions, causal explanatory paradigm. But they're equivalent and they're both necessary and they reflect how the mind operates. But time alone is irreducible, and I think certainly in quantum physics, time is not quantizable. It's continuous. But I think it's a metaphysical principle that time is irreducible, but it's indeterminate between observer and observed, even when thinking about awareness itself, irrespective of whether anything exists except awareness. Time is still indeterminate between observer and observed, where the observed in this case is just the fact of being aware, a concept of being aware, or a recognition that awareness exists. So it's a metaphysically more fundamental principle than Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which is kind of where it's leading us to. So that's it. I've published a couple of papers recently, and I've just submitted a new one with most of this stuff in it. I should say that these two opposite perspectives operating as awareness makes us very strong predictions about how the brain actually achieves consciousness, and actually it should be possible to derive certain facts about observer-observed interaction by studying brain dynamics. And I think there was a question earlier about, or a comment earlier about symmetry. What it suggests is that the brain operates by two, well, I think electromagnetic systems operating interactively, the sort of thing Penrose and Hamroff are talking about with their hierarchical electrical broadcasting system within microtubules. I think that may interact with neural synchrony, and that this interaction operates as a kind of a mutual dimensional reduction, and with a symmetry between them, where the symmetry, the conserved property is manifold invariant, so it's a compressive modeling. The two systems pitted against each other, trying to find the physical state that satisfies free energy principle, the principle of least action, with manifold invariance in their dimensionally different models. So that's probably for more than I thought I was going to say, but that's in the paper that I've just submitted. So thank you very much.
Since you brought up the fundamentality of awareness as a concept, I would like to point out that there are lines of philosophy in Hinduism which says the same thing, that awareness is fundamental. And it extends that now, as you were mentioning, the purpose of consciousness is to go back to this awareness itself and realize itself as solely awareness,
Well,
and not mingled with the observer.
well,
That would be the purpose of consciousness as understood from those line of thought.
Well, there's two things to say about that. First of all, I mean, awareness is phenomenally more certain than anything else, so it's phenomenally fundamental, but it can be, it's conceptually reducible, whereas time is not conceptually reducible. That's one of the points I'm trying to make, is that even when there's only awareness in this thought experiment, if nothing else exists, you still have two explanatory paradigms, and time is in a different place in the two paradigms. So, sorry, I forgot the second point you were saying.
The point is that the purpose of consciousness would now be to realize itself as awareness itself and not mingled with the observed world that we are interacting with. So that would be the purpose of consciousness as even.
Well, I think if you look at the way the two perspectives operate, there's always an observer and an observed.
Yes.
In the subjective perspective, the observed is the idea of being conscious, and it just becomes nothing. Everything is subjective. In the objective perspective, the observed begins to, well, we have the observer begins to look insignificant.
Always be there, but I'm just saying that the purpose is defining that.
Yeah.
I would like to bring back a question that she asked last talk that I think is also relevant here. That German philosopher, you said,
Leibniz.
described consciousness in terms of geist and perception. I would suggest that those are not symmetrical. They're completely different terms. Geist being more of an intellect mind, and intellect and mind requires time to associate the two things. And perception would be awareness alone, the mental space of awareness. So, how would those two things, yeah, I guess the question, what would be your take on that?
Well, I think I'd have to go back, try to disentangle those back, because for me, well, I think there's no awareness without time. I think that's the bottom line. So time is irreducible in some way, and both perspectives have time, and there are causal dynamics. And in the objective perspective, when the objective perspective dominates, we project all the causal dynamics into physical reality. But the fact is, we are conscious in this physical reality. We exist. And I think the explanatory model is that the conscious awareness is a hidden, unobservable, inexplicable frame of reference, simultaneously frame of reference for everything in its domain, which is all of you, everything that's happening in my frame of reference at the moment is just everybody in this room, plus my inner thoughts. So it's a kind of a two-way frame of reference for reality. And if I was a physicist, I would be just trying to describe objectively describe the percepts in my reality in a very closed way. And I wouldn't mention consciousness because physics, there's no consciousness in physical laws. It's just, that's the problem we're all trying to explain. How does it exist? Well, we know it exists. How do you explain it? But I think the best model is that it's a simultaneous epistemic frame of reference supporting regularities through time, such that, where physics can't do that because, well, physics, to put it this way, has to invent mathematical structures like gauge fields that have kind of causal, some determinist properties about them, and these are imagined to exist between infinitesimal points of motion. So they're conceptual, and that's in one branch of physics. Other branches of physics, the mathematics are different, and they tackle problems in a different way, and that creates its own sets of problems. And then you have thermodynamics with its arrow of time that's not time symmetrical. But where does time asymmetry come in? Nobody really knows that, as far as I know. I mean, there may be people here who can correct me, but as far as I know, you can't specify the granularity at which time asymmetry emerges thermodynamically. I think well, I would just say, in terms of the principles I'm trying to uncover, it's irreducible, whereas awareness can be reduced conceptually. Time is not conceptually reducible. You always need continuous time. It's always there.
One question about this, the invariance through time. So this somehow generates consciousness?
No, I think it's to try and find the. Well, I think if you were to try and see what's irreducible and what's fundamental, I think it's an irreducible description of consciousness is as two superposed, a subjective-objective complementarity. I think that's as far as you can go, but you can explain how the brain could do that. That will predict how the brain would do it, how the brain would achieve it, and it could achieve it by two informational systems. So when you get to that point of, in this approach, reducing consciousness to two perspectives superposed on each other, one of which will appear abstract to the other, which is why we have the hard problem in the objective perspective, and we have idealism, where people regard the physical reality. We have solipsism. The two are, one appears abstract to the other, but that's because that's how awareness operates. And you can use that principle to predict how the brain would produce that phenomenon, and it makes testable predictions, which I can't really go into here, but it does, because the brain is actually producing these two phenomena which interact in a certain way. They use, they're modeling the world. Each of them is trying to model the world from its perspective, but they're pitted against each other, and they achieve coupling, which is breaks the symmetries of their underlying dynamics, and that's in the paper. It's most of the paper, so this is just kind of the introduction.
Okay. Thank you. University, Poughkeepsie, New York. He's
Okay.
going to talk about the boundary problem, why constitutive panpsychists should endorse a powerful qualities theory of properties.
Okay, I'm going to race through the first half of this. So I'm going to introduce the boundary problem and try to discuss. I'm going to just sort of diagnose, right, what the root source is of the boundary problem for the panpsychist, and then offer a potential solution, which requires dispensing with some standard ontological assumptions that are commonly found, commonly endorsed uncritically by many panpsychists. So let's see here, is this even working? Oh, there we go. Okay, so in terms of the boundary problem, the question is just this. The problem, right, is, right, why are the boundaries drawn the way that they are in terms of phenomenal fields, right? So for the panpsychist, of course, right, if, right, you've got mentality, it's ubiquitous, why is it that, right, we have these discrete first personal experiences? Why are they, right, why are the boundaries, let's say, drawn around our craniums, right? So what element of the natural world then could explain this? And as I see it, as I'm arguing here, this problem, my co-author and I, Yancel Garcia, who couldn't be here, we think this problem is especially going to be acute for the constitutive panpsychist who endorses quidditism. Now, for those of you who don't work in metaphysics, don't worry, I'll introduce this to you. So the basic idea with quidditism, and again, I'll expand on this, is that, right, the essence of any property doesn't put any sort of causal or modal constraints on it at all. What you have is a kind of primitive thisness, as it were, right? And what you're going to get from this is that, right, what you find in terms of, in terms of the world is going to be radical contingency everywhere. This is why zombies, right, which are taken to be conceptually possible, then are also then regarded as being metaphysically possible. The alternative that I'm going to be presenting here is going to be such that zombies, while they may be conceptually possible, are not in fact metaphysically possible. And the reason why is because there's going to be necessary connections in the world. So what I'm going to be suggesting here is that we dispense with this particular metaphysic. And I think that there are independent reasons for endorsing the ontology that I'm presenting here. Here I'm just focusing on the utility of endorsing this view for the panpsychist. Okay, all right. So in terms of the general thesis then, what we're suggesting here is that a powerful qualities metaphysic can then actually provide us with the resources that we need to actually explain why the boundaries are in fact the way that they are. And in particular, right, this is going to be owing to the structure that's imposed on systems from their constitutive properties. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to first just expand a little bit on the boundary problem, say a little bit about constitutive panpsychism, focusing on Russellian panpsychism, and then I'll describe quidditism in more detail, and then offer an argument for why quidditism is lending itself to the boundary problem, and then present really quickly, just going to sketch what I'm calling a pan-powerful qualityist metaphysic of mind. This is a species of pan-protopsychism, okay? And then, right, the question then that I'll leave open is whether or not this is providing us with the tools that we need to actually have a solution to the boundary problem. Okay, so in terms of, again, just restating the problem here is this, right? Consciousness has these boundaries that are such that, right, they individuate us as these discrete, existing, experiencing subjects, right? And so the question then, right, that Rosenberg asks then, or the way that he states it is, right, we have to find something in nature to ground this possibility. He tries to give a causal solution. I don't think his works for reasons I won't go into here. I think it's, again, he's getting a little too close to the Humean sort of assumptions that are being widely endorsed by panpsychists, as opposed to going for the sort of approach that I'm adopting here, which is broadly neo-Aristotelian. So why is this going to be important? Well, Rosenberg offers the following. Notice he says, one, right, if it were not possible to draw these boundaries to the phenomenal field, human-like experiencing subjects couldn't exist. The fact that such boundaries exist where they do is surprising, and their basis is not obvious. So, right, why aren't you and I having the exact same experience right now, right? From a first personal standpoint, right? We might be experiencing the same things, but of course, what it's like to be me is not the same thing as what it's like to be you. For all I know, you're deeply moved by a sunset, and I'm not moved at all, let's say. Right, so again, we need a natural criterion here, right, that can allow us to explain the individuation, right, of these phenomenal fields. So, this brings us then to constitutive panpsychism. For those who are unfamiliar with this sort of, again, the sort of how to carve things up in terms of current work in the metaphysics of mind on panpsychism. So what constitutive panpsychists are going to endorse is the idea that many of you are going to be familiar with, I'm guessing here, is that micro experiences somehow add up to become macro experiences. So now in this case, right, macro phenomenal properties are not fundamentally basic, right? They're going to be complex properties, right? They're going to be owing to, right, again, a bunch of micro objects and their properties, right, summing up in some sort of way. right? And of course, that presents the combination problem. The boundary problem is actually one dimension of the combination problem, but I'm not going to get into the summing problem here. How is it that micro experiences sum up into macro experiences? I'm not going to try to even tackle that here. That's a big problem. Okay, so this brings us though more specifically to Russellian constitutive panpsychism, which is the version of constitutive panpsychism that's most widely endorsed in literature today. For those of you familiar with that, this is going to be familiar to you. And importantly, right, there's three core metaphysical commitments that that Russellian panpsychists have. The first is structuralism about physics. The second is realism about quiddities, and then finally quidditism about consciousness. And I'm focusing primarily on C. I have my worries about A, but I'm not going to present those here. All right. So regarding structuralism about physics, the basic idea is going to be this, is that physics is only telling us about the relational structure of the world, right? Nothing about the intrinsic nature of matter, of the stuff that we're describing in physics. Russellian monists are going to say, right, the whole story isn't going to be exhausted by these, right, structural descriptions. So that brings us then to quidditism, right? Or sorry, to realism about quiddities themselves, rather, sorry. So in this case, what they're going to say is that, right, the dispositions, right, that are now being described, right, so now think of a structural description of the world, right, the dispositions that you might be invoking and offering that sort of a description, that those are going to be grounded in quiddities, right? Now what's a quiddity? Well, a quiddity is going to be something that's a purely categorical, qualitative property, right? If you will, sometimes people talk about a primitive thisness of these kinds of properties, right? But importantly, the idea here is that the fundamental intrinsic nature of properties is non-causal, non-modal, right? So now, importantly, right, on this view then, it's going to be the case that you could have two possible worlds where you have the exact same objects, but the causal facts are going to be completely different, right? So you could have a possible world, for instance, where two particles with the same charge, as opposed to repelling each other, are attracted to each other on this view, okay? So it's going to be, again, a contingent fact about them, which gets us then to quidditism then about consciousness. So for the quidditist about consciousness, it's going to be the case that some quiddities are microphenomenal properties. And notice, yeah, you can start seeing how this makes things like zombies, right, not just conceivable, but actually metaphysically possible, right? You could have something that exhibits, right, the exact same functional integration as a system like you or I, but lacks phenomenal consciousness. Why? Because there won't be anything essential to phenomenally conscious properties, right, that is, right, they don't have a causal essence, right? That's going to be the same across any possible worlds. All right, so what quidditism then, right? So now let's get into quidditism, right, as a theory in the metaphysics of properties in ontology. Quidditism then again is going to say that the primitive identity of a property is floating free, right, from its causal role, right? So the causal identity of a property is going to be something completely contingent, right? So think about it in terms of grounding, purely categorical properties, right? They are going to contingently ground the dispositions of the objects that are possessing them. So the following then are standard commitments of quidditism in the literature that you find. The first is nomological contingentism. So it's going to be the case that whether you understand laws of nature as governing or purely descriptive, the laws of nature are contingent, right? Second is conceivability and possibility. So what's going to be conceivable is metaphysically possible. So now notice conceivability is now going to be a reliable guide to metaphysical possibility. The third is a combinatorialism about metaphysical possibility. What's going to be metaphysically possible is just however you could recombine things, right? And then finally, we get unrestricted composition. So it's going to be metaphysically possible that any combination of things can actually compose an object. Now, it's going to turn out that the metaphysics of properties that I'm suggesting is, I think, again, I think there are independent reasons to endorse it. We're going to end up denying all of these things, right, with the view that I endorse, okay? And again, I think there are independent reasons for endorsing that view. I'm not going to go into those here. All I'm going to do is just focus on the utility of endorsing that view to then provide us with a solution to the boundary problem. Okay, so here's an argument then for why quidditism lends itself to the boundary problem that I've identified. Or I didn't identify it. It was Greg Rosenberg who first identified it as far as I know. So premise one, quidditism is true. Premise two, if quidditism is true, then properties place no modal or causal constraints on the objects that possess them. Three, if properties place no modal or causal constraints on the objects that possess them, and I should actually, I'm sorry, what I need to have here is no necessary modal or causal constraints on the objects that possess them. In any case, sorry about that. I just realized something that's missing there. So if properties place no such constraints on the objects that possess them, then for any two macrophenomenal fields of discrete cognitive systems, there exists no metaphysically necessary boundary that serves to individuate them. So if there doesn't exist such a boundary, right, that serves to individuate macrophenomenal fields, then there's no criterion that illuminates the specialness of some patterns over others, so there's no criterion that illuminates the specialness of some patterns over others. Okay, so there's the argument then for, right, why we end up getting a boundary problem from assuming quidditism. So what's the alternative? So what I want to suggest here is what I'm calling this pan-powerful qualityist metaphysic of mind. And so here's the baseline assumption I have about minds. And I won't go into all the details here. The basic idea here is I take it that minds are information processors that exhibit a requisite kind of functional integration. But importantly, right, these systems are also conscious. Right? Those are my main assumptions here. Okay, so now then, right, what we're going to be doing then here is, right, we have this background assumption about what a mind is going to be. And what I want to be suggesting here is that, right, systems are going to have, right, that functional integration as a matter of necessity owing to their properties, and the boundaries then are going to be fixed, right, by those properties, right, that are, right, constitutive of, right, that particular system. Where you find a constellation of properties that exhibits the requisite kind of integration, you're going to have, right, a conscious phenomenal field, and it couldn't be anything else. It couldn't be, right, it couldn't bleed into another one. All right, so here then gets us into this metaphysics, the ontology of properties that I'm thinking about, that I'm assuming here, which is one of powerful qualities. And again, I'm not going to be arguing for it here. Elsewhere, I've argued for, for realism about powers. For the powerful qualities view, I can't think of anybody better than John Heil or Charlie Martin. So the idea here is going to be is that, right, the intrinsic properties of objects are powers, right? But they're also qualities. So one way of thinking about this here, so I'm assuming an identity view for those of you who are at all familiar with the debates about this, as opposed to a compound view or what's called a grounding view. So I'm assuming that powers are both, the properties are powers and qualities. They're the same thing under two different descriptions. Okay, so this exact same property that you have, right, is both a power and a quality. So one way to think about this here, an argument that was first presented by Stephen Mumford here is now think about, right, a motivation for this idea. So think about the charge of an electron, right? Notice, right, the charge of an electron, right, is something that is a categorical property of it. It is what it is owing to its charge, right? But it's also a power is the thought here, right? So notice the charge of the electron is both something qualitative that is occupying a causal role, and it's something that's also doing things, right? So notice, right, so if power P is the occupant of causal role R, right, and we've got number 2, quality Q is the occupant of causal role R, so the same thing. So it's an identity argument here. Okay, so here's a few other quick assumptions about these. I'm going to go over these very quickly, but we can talk about them if people want to. So first assumption is going to be that most powers are going to be multi-track. They're going to be directed at multiple different kinds of manifestations with different partners. So I have some examples there with the sodium cation, right? In virtue of its positive charge, it's going to be disposed to form ionic bonds, right, with different things. Their manifestations are pleiotropic, right? So they're going to contribute to multiple outcomes. And then causal processes themselves are going to involve constellations of powers interacting with each other, right? So there's a kind of synchronic aspect then to causation that oftentimes is missed on the Humean picture. The Humean picture takes causes and effects to always be, right, diachronic. One precedes the other. On this picture, right, it could be the case as soon as you have, let's say, some water and salt and they're interacting with each other, we've already got, right, as soon as they're interacting, you've got an effect that's being produced. And it's simultaneous, right, with their interacting with one another. That's not to suggest that there's not a diachronic dimension, but the point here is right, causal processes are not as simple as what you're going to get with these atom diagrams a la David Lewis or Hume. Okay, so really quickly then, how do we build a metaphysic of mind out of this? So first, now think about the properties qua powers. Qua powers, right, we end up getting a kind of pan-intentionalism on this view. Right, all properties on this view are going to be directed at a range of different manifestations with different partners. So you have a kind of, right, again, aboutness to properties, fundamental properties, right? So in terms of intentionality, notice a state's going to exhibit some degree of intentionality to the extent that, number 1, notice it's about or directed at something. It's directed at things that are present or may not be present. Notice in this case, think about, again, the charge of the electron. It's going to be directed at certain kinds of, right, interactions, right? It's going to be directed at repelling things that have the same charge, right? it's going to be directed at being attracted to things that have an opposing charge. And then the third, then finally, they can exhibit indeterminacy with respect to what they refer to, right? So the reference could be fixed by a particular context. And all powers are going to exhibit all three of these. The second, then, is an informational thesis. Powers themselves are going to be carrying information for their manifestations. Again, go back to the point about their directedness. So William Bauer puts this in terms of them having map-like representational content, if you will, for lack of a better way of putting it, right? So notice what he says, right? Powers carry representational yet non-propositional map-like information geared toward their potential manifestations, right? So the thought here is going to be that, right, they are, if you will, bearers of information in a very thin sense. Just like the notion of intentionality that we have here is a very thin notion of intentionality. But once we move to the level of systems like you and me, it's much more robust, right? We are robust information processors, right? We exhibit robust intentionality. Okay, and then finally, right, we end up getting, right, powers holism. Sometimes it's called causal structuralism. In this case now, the identities of tokens of macro power types, in this case, they're going to be fixed and necessitated by their place within the system, right? The kind of role that they're playing is going to be owing to, right, their being, right, positioned as part of a larger system. Again, I can go over this more slowly if people have questions, but I'm going to kind of move through this quickly here. So Williams, this is a nice quote from Neil Williams, and I'm just going to skip it because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. We can go back to it if people want. So finally, this gets us to the proto-phenomenalism. This is now the part that we, I think, care about when we're talking now about consciousness. So now properties then are also going to be qualities. I assume then that properties on this view, so this is, if anybody here is familiar with the work of Hedda Mark, on her view, it's going to be the case that, right, now think about a unmanifested power of a fundamental particle. It is going to be phenomenal on her view. I'm denying that. That's why I'm saying this is a kind of pan-proto-psychist view, okay? So if you will, what my thought here is that matter is pregnant with consciousness. It is not itself, right, again, sort of in a state of rest conscious. Because consciousness exhibits, there's a kind of something dynamic about it, right? So now the thought's going to be this, right? There's something it's like for a power to be manifested. There's something it's like now for two particles to bond with each other. That's the thought, or for two particles to repel each other. Right? So it's when you have the manifestation of the powers that you're now going to have, right, in a causal process that you're going to find phenomenality. But the thought here is right, this is owing to them, again, being both powers and qualities. Okay. So now then, right, in this case, conscious experience on this view is going to be the manifestation of the constitutive constellations of properties that are going to be, right, configured in a right sort of way in a causal process. So the thought here then is right, consciousness is a causal process. That's the basic idea here. Okay, all right. So actually there's a nice quote here from Charlie Martin. Notice what he says. He says that any account of the mind, sensory input and imagery must be seen as a product or result of processing, right? So that's the basic idea that we have here. It's this product that is in turn the material of use. Unlike Martin though, I think that this actually happens at a pretty basic level. In other words, what I'm suggesting is right, the particle, right, that's not, right, that's whose powers are not being manifested, there's nothing it's like to be that thing. But once it's being manifested, there's something that's like. So we're going to see actually, right, it's going to be the case that you're going to find micro experiences, it's not going to be as fundamental as many panpsychists think it'll be. I'm just going to skip the Lockwood quote because it's quite long. How much time do I have? Where are we at with time? I'm good? Okay. All right, I'm trying to race through some of this. So, okay. So notice now, in this case now, it's going to be the case that the organization of the mind as a system, right, is now going to be determined by these, right, constitutive objects that are making up the system and their properties. And again, right, if you will, the boundaries now then for phenomenal fields should now be found where we find cognitive unity, right? To where, insofar as you have a system that you can now describe as a discrete information processor, therein lie the boundaries. That's the idea here. But now notice some of you might think, oh, that just looks like functionalism. Yuck, right? I don't like that. Me don't like you, right? Okay. But again, keep in mind here, what we have here is an ontology of properties that is not allowing us to detach qualitativity from dispositionality. They are of a piece. They are two sides of the same coin, if you want to use that kind of imagery. I want to be very careful about that, though, because I'm endorsing the identity view versus a compound view, which takes the properties to be Janus-based. Okay? So again, right, so notice the causal identity of any state of the system, in this case, is essentially tied to its qualitative identity. Right? They don't float free of each other. So now the boundaries of phenomenal fields on this picture are going to be delivered by the boundaries of cognitive systems. Okay. All right. So in brief then, right, these boundaries are going to be metaphysically necessary. They're not contingent because, again, I'm denying the quidditist assumption that we've got, that the identities of properties, right, that their causal profile floats free of their primitive identity. Their primitive identity is causal on this picture. Their primitive identity is one such that, right, it's going to place necessary constraints on how they can be combined. Right, so notice, right, the same collection of objects and their properties organized in the same way can't but be a discrete cognitive system. And as such, given the assumption about properties, also then be phenomenally conscious. So on this picture then, zombies are not going to be metaphysically possible, even if they're going to be conceivable. Actually, I'm going to question whether they're really conceivable. I think there might be a misunderstanding. Okay, all right. So I'm going to stop. Anything else I have to say about that is going to be unimportant. So again, in brief then, I think this provides us with a way out of the boundary problem. Whether or not panpsychists are going to join me on this, I don't know. We'll wait and see. All right, thank you. You just still have this thing? Or?
Maybe I'll ask a question.
Oh, there's a hand there, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. What is, in principle, new in this panpsychism is equal to invariant or hyperpsychism?
Oh, yeah, it's good. That's a really good question. Yeah, if anything, what I'm doing is I'm telling panpsychists that they should go back and look at Aristotle. In other words, they stop with Hume, right? So they're basically assuming a Humean picture, which they've inherited from David Lewis. And what I'm suggesting is, we should endorse a neo-Aristotelian metaphysic, and that can actually give us more resources for now solving some of these problems. Again, I think there are independent motivations, if you get into debates in the metaphysics of science, for endorsing this kind of a picture over the neo-Humean picture. Here I'm just trying to point to the utility of endorsing this. But you're exactly right. This is neo-Aristotelianism. Again, it's updated in Aristotle, but yeah, that's a whole big movement in the metaphysics of science, of which this is a piece with. Yeah.
Thank you for thought. Well, since you are giving a kind of theory of properties, I'm just wondering if you're thinking of them in terms of universals or tropes.
Yeah.
And if this does matter, I suppose you are thinking in terms of universals.
Actually, I'm not. I'm actually a trope theorist. Yeah, I think they're. Well, yeah, I think they're modes of substances. So I have a two-category ontology myself. So I'm not. I don't going for bundle theory here, but I'll try to be neutral on that. Because a lot of times, if you say trope theory, people assume you're a bundle theorist, right? Yeah. That everything's a bundle of tropes. Yeah, I don't endorse that view. I take substances to then have their properties are particulars.
But not in terms of like the trope metaphysics.
Yeah.
How to explain what the substance is. But you are assuming that what you call properties are tropes or universals.
I think I can be neutral on whether they are Armstrongian universals or tropes. So that's in the paper. We are officially neutral on that point because what we're interested in are property instances, right? And so property instances, you can now either think about them in terms of instances of these universals, a la Armstrong, or as tropes, a la Williams, let's say. So yeah.
Okay, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our next speaker is going to be Yoshiyuki Ohmura from University of Tokyo.
Thank you for the introduction. My talk is what is volition? My position is basically physicalism, so I don't use term mental causation, but my talk is very related with mental causation. In dictionary, volition is a mental power to make one's own decision. However, in science, what is mind is a big problem. In science cannot explain what is mind, so physicalism position use different terms. So, according to neuroscientist Patrick Fazard, Harald, volition has following features: lead to movement, no external trigger, reason responsive, goal directed, spontaneous, and involve consciousness. So, and neuroscientists have proposed the brain area corresponding to these features, but such neuroscientific explanation cannot explain, cannot be applied to robotics or artificial intelligence. So neuroscientific theory is far from universality. So my goal is to make a theory of volition that it can apply to robot and other artifacts. I am my specialty is robotics, so I'm interested in the robot with volition. In this presentation, I will discuss about the mechanism of internally generated cause to explain two features of volition: no external trigger and goal directed. This conference is about consciousness, but I cannot our proposed mechanism and consciousness and relationship. We don't currently understand the relationship between consciousness and our theories. So I don't address consciousness. Internally generated cause should be independent of external cause and not due to fluctuation or random noise, because randomness cannot explain this reason responsiveness. We assume that internally generated causes are internally generated goals that is used to achieve future desired state rather than being determined past physical states. Therefore, we hypothesized goal-directed negative feedback control is involved in volition. In philosophical debates, the internally generated cause or emergent cause is considered to be impossible because such causation is contradictory with physical determinism or microdeterminism. Physical determinism assumes that all physical change are caused by external cause and initial conditions. And some philosophers argue that internally generated cause is impossible. According to Jang-gon Kim, physical causal completeness excludes any internally generated cause because such emergent cause suffer from the problem of overdetermination. How can the brain generate cause internally is a big problem in volition. In this presentation, we argue that such internally generated causes are compatible with physics. In this study, we assume that internally generated cause is a new macro-level cause. Our idea of macro-level cause is inspired from Roger Sperry's debate on macrodeterminism. Roger Sperry is a famous neuroscientist about split brain. Sperry hypothesized that macro level has a new emergent causal power to its part. He believed that the macro determines saves volition and free will from epiphenomenalism. But the whole to its part causation is considered to be impossible because the same reasons above, according to Kim, he pointed out such whole to part causation would suffer from the problem over determination. Here I will explain the problem of over determination. In the hierarchical system, if the macro level supervenes on the micro, and the macro have the new causal power over its parts, then this should be redundant because the macro level behavior completely determined by the micro mechanism alone. The same cause cannot determine an event redundantly from both the entire system and its parts. This is a problem of overdetermination. How does the macro have new non-redundant causal power over its part is not clear. Conventional debates on whole-to parts cause assumes that such causation is impossible because such causation suffer from the problem of determination. To clarify whole-to parts causation, we must resolve the problem of overdetermination. In this study, we assume that inter-level negative feedback control between the macro level and micro level. But conventional debate on downward or whole-to parts causation did not assume such inter-level negative feedback control. We propose that the inter-level negative feedback control enables the whole-to parts causation. First, I will explain negative feedback control. In engineering, negative feedback control is familiar to realize goal-directedness. Negative feedback control involves two mechanisms: observing feedback error and control to reduce the feedback error. Importantly, these two mechanisms can be implemented in the different levels of the hierarchy. Next, I will explain the inter-level negative feedback control. At the macro level, feedback error is controllable because the macro supervenes on the micro. And macro level, if macro level, at the macro level, and feedback error can be observed, then feedback control is possible. Importantly, the observation of the feedback error at the macro level and the control at the micro level are different events in the hierarchy. And the relationship between the macro and the micro in inter-level negative feedback is asymmetric. This is the important point. But the inter-level negative feedback control is not sufficient to explain internally generated cause, because internally generated cause must need macro level feedback error must be independent from external cause. But the goal of typical feedback control is to converge a signal derived from measurement to a desired to reference. And the actual output signal, the difference between reference and the output is the feedback error. And feedback control, the goal of feedback control is to reduce the feedback error. But this reference is often provided from outside the system. But such reference is not internally generated cause, but external cause. So we have to remove the reference. To explain internally generated cause, external cause is not suitable. We have to clarify the method to describe the feedback error solely in terms of well-defined variables and functions of the system itself, independent of external cause. To define such feedback error, there are some assumptions. First, we assume that there is a hierarchical structure in the brain. Second, we assume that macro is a set of mathematical functions. Each function supervenes on physical neural networks. Third, the mathematical functions have plasticity. The input and output relationship can be modified by synaptic weights at the micro level. The micro level consists of neuron and synapse within the neural network macro level. This is a macro level neural network modules, and this is a within the this neuron and synapse is within macro neural network modules. The micro level the macro level relationship can be modified by the synaptic weight. To explain internally generated codes, we have to clarify how to describe well-defined equations at the macro level, independent of external codes. We propose that axioms that define algebraic structure of a set of mathematical functions can be used to determine macro-level feedback error. For example, commutativity can be used to define the macro-level feedback error. Function f and g supervene on physical neural networks. In this equation, x is an input, system input, and this is external code. This equation has well-defined for all input x. In general, commutativity is not satisfied in the arbitrary algebraic structure, so it is not trivial. So we can use this commutativity to the interlevel negative feedback control. And importantly, this equation is independent of external cause x, because against all x, this formula can be satisfied, must be satisfied. This is a summary of whole two parts causation mechanism. The interlevel negative feedback control and macro feedback error equation that is defined by algebraic structure of supervenient functions enable whole two parts causation. Importantly, the condition of interlevel negative feedback control and the macro level description of feedback error both needed to realize macro whole two parts causation. Macro level provides new codes, and codes become effective through inter-level negative feedback control. At the macro level, we anticipate that the change of equation for defining feedback error occasionally changes. If this is true, such macro level event have causal power, because observation at the macro level and feedback control at the micro level is different events. A model of whole two parts causation can explain some key feature of volition. No external trigger and goal-directedness. But, and spontaneous is probably explained by the change in equation to define macro level feedback error. In this mechanism, the micro level, such as the neurophysiology, don't determine the system, overall system behavior or the during all the future. So this mechanism supports the macro determinism. However, our proposed mechanism cannot explain how the feedback error equation change at the macro level. In order to completely explain the internally generated cause in volition, we must clarify the mechanism that change in future work. The relationship between the mechanism that change the feedback error equation and free will or volition remain an open issue. Furthermore, we have no evidence of interlevel negative feedback control in the living brain. This is an important open issue. Finally, to explain volitional control, we must clarify the relationship between this formulation and motion generation and consciousness. This is conclusion. We propose a synaptic weight at the micro satisfies the physical law and mathematical constraint at the macro level. So this is compatible with physicalism. Through interlevel negative feedback control, the synaptic weight at the micro level satisfies this interlevel negative feedback control that constrains the algebraic structure of neural network is plausible explanation for whole two-path causation. We believe that the whole two-path causation mechanism is involved in volition because it explains some key features of volition, especially internally generated cause. Thank you for your attention.
It's very interesting. I think you've explained agency in terms of the wholeness of the organism acting on as a whole, and then maybe what I would call downward causation.
Yeah.
But you haven't explained the goal setting, and I think you need consciousness.
Yeah, it's important problem. But currently I don't answer. So, I think that this question is clarified by the simulation, or because we set the actions or feedback error and simulate the physical system, so we can know the function of this action or feedback error. So if our knowledge is increased, then the change mechanism of these equations can be clarified in the future, I believe.
I found your idea pretty interesting. And this macro as a level of the macro to micro as an eradication and control.
Yeah.
Plasticity seems quite plausible, I thought. But at the same time, the main argument historically about this interlevel or over-causal determination is probably something to do with the phenomenal level or phenomenal category to physical category.
Oh.
If you're kind of assuming this macro and also micro in both the physical domain, then the supervenience kind of relationship also.
Yeah, this is not, according to Kim, this is not limited to phenomenal and phenomenal macro and micro level.
Yeah, okay. But having said that, then if it's within both physical,
Yeah.
and then one level, the macro level is already supervened from the micro, then this causes some change in the micro seems to be kind of more or less trivial.
Yeah, but this is not. This is different from this example because the supervenient macro and the micro neuron share the physical entity. So, in your example, the micro level is different from the macro. But my proposal is the macro and the micro share same physical entity.
Yeah, so that's
Same, yeah.
it seems it's not
So,
radical or it doesn't solve the standard problem, I thought. But maybe I don't know.
I'm a faculty in control systems also, so you could reach me directly. So I understand whatever you told there. Just I wanted to have one question. Did you experience or did you notice any volition coming out of the system as you did this interlevel feedback control?
your question is the related motion generation?
You implemented the system?
Oh, yeah, I have implemented,
So
yeah.
you had some goal objective for the
Yeah.
Apart from that, did you experience the robot to also get some volition, something it does which you did not give it as a goal, but it also did something?
But I currently implement this theory to only represent learning, so the actual robot cannot generate movement by this theory currently. So this is future works.
One quick question now, before we lose the. First, I just want to ask on Benjamin Libet experiment.
Libet.
You can see what, and this is a pure case of external volition, exactly what you want. You can follow the neurological story before, meaning during the process of the volition, and maybe you can. It will tell you where it's happening, what's going on. It just will help you, and then you can see if you have interlevel processes that govern, give you some kind of top-down. But what I'm saying, we can just look at the experiment. And then another point I wanted to make is that sometimes you don't need consciousness really, because you can have sometimes unconscious goals. You can solve problems unconsciously. So somehow you may have some kind of feedback, and eventually you solve the problem. You wake up in the morning. Okay, but with the
About consciousness, difficult question, but I think I would focus the mental causation or agent causation. So I don't understand about what is conscious or phenomenal consciousness. I cannot answer such a question now, but maybe I believe that, but this causal mechanism is related with such a consciousness.
I'm just quick thought, and that was, I wonder if your solution involves endorsing a different view of causation than Kim has in mind. So I think Kim is thinking about everything as efficient causes, whereas it sounds like the macro level programming you're talking about looks more like kind of formal or structural causation. In which case, I think you actually kind of get around the problem, right? which is to actually afford a different kind of causal role to the macro level powers, right? Vis-a-vis, right? Does that make sense? In other words, they have different sorts of, they're doing different stuff, right? One of those involves a violation of conservation principles. The other does not, right? Namely, efficient causation would be problematic. And that's what Kim's worry is. But it seems like your solution involves a kind of programming solution, which looks to me like formal causation, which is not where the worry is coming from. So it sounds like to me like what you're suggesting is a different sort of role from that.
But this mechanism can enable macro determinism. So if this is not efficient causation, but this is not problem for me, because macro has unique individual causal power or law and to affect neuron level. So this is
What I'm suggesting is a different kind of effect.
yeah.
Sense, right? So in other words, what I'm suggesting is that you don't have to learn to accept Kim's assumptions about causation. Does that make sense? He's just working with a framework.
But the definition of
Causes are efficient causes.
causation so important.
No, it is important. But what I'm suggesting here is there's different kinds of causes. And people have been arguing in more recent literature, including myself, that it could be a structural formal role that the relevant properties are playing. And that's what it looks like you have it, but not what Kim was saying. So it's just a friendly sort of comment.
It's just coming back to the first question because I'm not sure I understood your answer. So, for example, I want to ask a question, so I raise my arm. That's what I understand by volition. So, if I understand you correctly, your negative feedback mechanism explains to what level I need to raise my hand.
Yeah.
So it's not there yet, or until I get there. But how does your model then explain that I want to raise my arm in the first place, which is what, in my understanding, is
Yeah.
more the volition rather than the process of raising it a bit
I'm robotics, so I want to know this mechanism, but I don't know correctly. But this mechanism is very related with representation learning or symbolic grounding problem. So if we connect the symbol and the physical entity, we can understand something or behavior or environment. So if system can understand behavior or environment, then the system can make a behavior. I want to, so this is correct.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is going to be Jiawei Chu from Stanford University, and he's going to talk about relational realism of the self. The self is precognitive alignment between brain and environment.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Hi everyone, I'm Jiawei Xu. It's my great honor to be here to share our recent research on the relational nature of the self. We aim to provide a new approach to the ontological problem of the self. We call it relational realism of the self. We believe that the self is not any individual entity, but a relation. More specifically, the precognitive alignment between our brain and its environment. And tonight, due to time constraints, I will present the core ideas and arguments for the relational self. The problem of the self. What is the self in its nature? This problem has puzzled philosophers for centuries. As early as the ancient Roman periods, St. Augustine has raised these problems, and René Descartes even regards that the answer to the problem of the self as the reliable foundation of knowledge. Since the explanation and understanding of consciousness and its united brain-body relation and knowledge of the world, knowledge of other minds, moral responsibility, moral agents, all of these topics are connected with our views of the nature of the self. So the answer to this problem is the central point, the starting point and key that should not be ignored for the research in philosophy of mind, epistemologies, or even the emerging philosophy of AI. The problem of the self has not only had substance attentions from philosophers, but also it also has become an important topic in science. For example, neuroscientist Antonio Damasio and psychologist Bruce Hood provide their own theories of minds, like the precise theory, the illusion theories. Meanwhile, many contemporary philosophers, also inspired by empirical evidence, to provide various theories of the self. But these various emerging views of the self that take into account empirical evidence from different science still seldom step outside these outside three traditional approaches. It claims the self is an entity, or that is an intrinsic positive of our consciousness, or that the self is nothing more than an illusion or fictions constructed by our imagination, reflection, social interaction, or narratives. This is because our discussion about the self is limited by our presuppositions about the self. We believe that if the self is true, is real, then it must be a continuous, stable, and intrinsically self-determined being. For example, a separate entity like the spiritual entity, like our brain, our body, or an organism. And if the self is real, it must be different from others and its environment at a very basic level. And it means that the self, non-self distinction is primitive, and the self, non-self relation is secondary, constructive. And the self is also supposed to be the true and shared basis of the unity of conscious experience, the construction and change of the empirical self and other self-related phenomena. But these presuppositions about the self have many shortcomings, like lacking of defense. They also have cultural limitations and internal contradictions. For example, cultural psychologists find that Western people tend to define their self as separate entities, but Eastern people tend to perceive their selves as relations. For example, self-other relation. That means not all people think that ourselves is an individual entity. And in Eastern culture, we believe that the relation can also be the basic thing in the world, and the individual entity is determined by the change, the stains of the relation. It means that our presuppositions about the self has more underlying presuppositions at the ontological level. It implies substance realism, entity realism, or property realism. In our study and books I published last year, we aim to argue that the self is fundamentally neither an entity, nor property, nor fiction, or illusion, but rather a dynamic relation, a precognitive spatial temporal brain environment relation. And furthermore, the self can be epistemologically and even ontologically real as a relational being. This self-view is what we describe as relational realism of the self. And here I will show you the argument for the self as relations. We no longer assume that the self is an individual entity or separate single properties, but we still insist that if we want to find something as ourselves, it should be the shared basis or clue of various self-related phenomenon. If there is a shared basis like this basis or clue can be reasonably regarded as the basic self or the clue self. A great deal of evidence from neuroscience show that the spatial temporal features of resting state activity in our brains, especially in our default mode networks, are closely related to different types of self-referential processing, meaning self-consciousness and self-continuity. At the beginning of this century, neuroscientists find that the cortical midnight structure may be the neural correlates of ourself. But meantime, other researchers find that the CMS is not only active in self-referential processing, but also active when we are mind wandering. It's only inhibited when the brain processes other related, non-self-related information. It means that our brains continuously constructs the model of the self. And many studies show that the spatial temporal features of our resting state activity can predict the level of self-consciousness, especially private self-consciousness, and also predicts judgment of stimulus, attribution to the self or not, and the degree of self-continuity. And recent decades, there's many other evidence show that the spatial temporal structure of our resting state activity is directionally coupled to the spatial temporal structure of our body and the environment. For example, the resting state activity is aligned to the spatial temporal structure of other organs of the body, like stomach and our heart. And resting state activity is also aligned to the spatial temporal structure of our social environment and physical environment. Like this picture shows that a study finds that the guitarists play, the musicians play guitar together in and their brains align to each other from during the preparation periods and the beginning of the concept. Yeah. It means that their brains align their own structure to others' brains. And in the workshop yesterday, I also know that our brains aligns their structure to the temporal structure of Earth. Based on evidence 1 and 2, we can infer that the spatial temporal features of our brain's spontaneous activities are central to connect various self aspects, and that they are at least partially determined by the spatial temporal alignment of the brain's spontaneous activity with the body and the environment. That means various self aspects may be closely related to the brain-body and brain environment alignment. What does alignment means here? It's mathematical terms. It means the directional coupling between different fluctuations. We can use an example to show what is alignment. It is dance. It's just like dance. Our brain dance to the rhythms of the body and the rhythms of the environment. And further, there's other evidence shows that a certain degree of alignment of the brain's spontaneous activity to the body and to the environment is a necessary basis for consciousness and is united. For example, from wakefulness to deep sleep, the brain's alignment with habits decrease, and with recovery in the rapid eye movement stage. In rapid eye movement stage, we are dreaming. That means we have discrete conscious experience. And varying degrees of brain environment alignment can be modeled for LT states of consciousness, like the figure on the top, includes from wakefulness. It has the highest degree of spatial temporal alignment, and anesthesia, brain death shows lower degrees of spatial temporal alignment. And brain spontaneous activity with too much, too little, or disruptive alignment to the environment shows abnormal self-experience. This kind of evidence is from psychiatrists. And for example, in schizophrenia, the schizophrenic patient shows disruption of first person perspective. Sometimes they attribute their own thoughts, actions, and other mental or physical activities to other people. And they show breakdown of the self and non-self distinction. On the neuronal level, the default mode network of these patients abnormally active, and the central executive networks abnormally inhibited. It means the default mode network is related to the self-processing, and CEM is more related to environment information processing. It means our brain is not only focused on itself and no longer aligns its own structures to the environment. And when the alignment between brain and environment is disrupted, and it shows the disruption of first poison perspective. And similar phenomenon also shown, also observed in other mental disorders like bipolar disorder and anxiety disorder. And the generation of empirical self-variation can be partially explained by difference in brain body and brain environment alignment. For example, in body illusion experiments, the dynamics of the embodied self and no self can be explained by the alignment of the brain to a rubber hand or to other virtual body in a virtual world. And in 2023, we published empirical papers focus on the cultural difference in the degree of brain-to-brain alignments among Chinese participants and among Canadian participants. And higher brain-to-brain alignment were observed among Chinese subjects rather than Canadian subjects. It means that Chinese people align their own brains to the social environment at a higher level. And it can be deduced from evidence 3 to 4 that the spatial temporal alignment and balance of the brain's spontaneous activity to the body and the environment is the shared and necessary basis for different types of self-related phenomenon. And a change in this relation can lead to a change or even loss in the level of consciousness and is united. A disturbance in first-person perspective, a change or breakdown in the self-non-self distinction, and a change or anomaly in the empirical self. Then we can draw a conclusion based on the combination of primus 1 and inference 2. The spatial temporal alignment and balance of the self-spontaneous activities to the body and the environment we refer to as the brain-environment relation, because the body is also an intimate environment of the brain. The brain-environment relation can be reasonably considered as the basic self. So, furthermore, we can propose a new possible model for the self. On the first level is the most basic self, the relational self, okay. And is the precognitive brain-environment relation. Why is precognitive? Because it's the basis of our cognition and it's the basis of our consciousness and other connections, cognitive activities. And according to the evidence from psychiatrists, the abnormal higher level of brain-environment alignment or the abnormal lower level of alignment will lead to the abnormal of subjectivity. So I draw an inverted U-straight to show that only when our brains aligns to the environment at a proper degrees, it can be the higher level of sense of the sense of self. It means only in the middle area of the continuum, we can have a higher level of higher level of sense of self. And we have different self-concepts like independent self-concept or interdependent self-concepts. It's not only determined by the underlying relational self, it's also influenced by other factors like our social cultural factors. Okay, my presentation is that. Thank you.
Because they consist of
Thank you for your questions. I don't know my understanding of the question is correct or not. I think the first question is related to the identity or the continuity of the self. Yes, our environment change every day, even every moment, but we feel that our self is continuant. It's because the basic self is the alignment between our brain and the environment in terms of the structures, the spatial-temporal structures, not the quantums. Even though the quantums of the environment change a lot, but the structure of the environment may be the same or similar. For example, I live in China, and now I am in spring, but there's a lot of life experience is similar here and in China, so I can still know how to buy a meal or have dinner in restaurant, and I know how to make reservation in hotel. Many different structure of the environment is still similar, but maybe the speed, the temporal structure of the different environment is a little bit different. For example, maybe the temporal structure in American is maybe more faster than in China, for example. But if our brains aligns its structure to the environment at a certain level, it shows we will feel our self is continuous. Only when the alignment is disrupted, we will feel the lower level of self-continuity. And another point is our body is also the most intimate environments of our brains. As long as we can align our brain to the structure of other organs of our bodies, aligned to the lips of our body, it can maintain a certain level of self-continuity. Yeah. And the second question is, oh, okay.
Maybe one last question.
Okay. I also mentioned Heidegger's and Marx in my boards, but not here because the time constraints. And I show multiple levels of model of the self here, and I think the social cultural environments contributes on the higher level, the cognitive level, and the environment I proposed here is on the precognitive, the most basic level is my brain. Our brain aligns to the environment, the very general basic environment, not the cognitive environment. We perceive, we understand, we know each other at the higher level. And I think there's interaction between different levels. There's two approaches, from the top to the bottom and from the bottom to the top. So I agree, other social cultural environment also contributes to the self, to the characteristic of the self. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Instead of looking for the anthropocentric, for a more relationship, with nature.
Yes.
Heidegger said, right? Heidegger said
Yes.
about the dwelling, building, and thinking, about the relationship among the God, the divinities, the earth, the sky, and the immortals. So I think West thought can also contribute a little bit to the study. Also Middle Ages, theological, philosophical.
We're 4 minutes over, so let's...
Thank you so much for your suggestions. Recently I also focused on the Donna Haraway's theories. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.